Welcome back to Martial Arts in Chinese Literature and Films. This is our last lecture for this class. At the conclusion of our journey, we'll talk about an animated film you might have been familiar with since childhood, Kung Fu Panda. In this lecture, we'll situate the Kung Fu Panda films within the larger themes of our class and spend some time discussing the historical contexts of China-West cultural and political relations. The Kung Fu Panda series draw from the martial arts or wuxia tradition and present an image of China to the American public. Now a trilogy, the series is a media franchise produced by DreamWorks Animation. Preparations for the first film began as early as 2004, and it's been reported it was initially conceived to be a spoof of Kung Fu Hustle and other martial arts films, but later it was reconceptualized as a character-driven action comedy. The first Kung Fu Panda film was co-directed by John Stevenson and Mark Osborne. Stevenson is a British filmmaker with over 40 years of experience in animation, having worked as an artist or art director in films including Little Shop of Horrors and Shrek. Osborne is an American film director, writer, producer, and animator. He has worked as a director for the SpongeBob SquarePants series and directed the 3D film The Little Prince in 2015. The first Kung Fu Panda film was a huge box office success, grossing around $215 million in the United States and Canada and $416 million overseas. Upon its success, Kung Fu Panda II was released 3 years later in 2011. This time, it was directed by Jennifer Yuh Nelson, who was head of story for the first film. Jennifer Yuh Nelson is a Korean-American storyboard artist and film director, and she continued to direct the third Kung Fu Panda movie as well. With the Kung Fu Panda films, Yuan became the first woman and the first Asian American to solely direct an animated feature from a major Hollywood studio. Kung Fu Panda II grossed $665 million worldwide and remained the highest grossing film directed by a woman until Frozen 2 years ago, which was co-directed by Chris Buck and Jennifer Lee. Kung Fu Panda 3 didn't do as well in box office as the previous two films, but it was still highly financially successful, earning $521 million worldwide. The Kung Fu Panda series have won many film and animation awards, and both Kung Fu Panda 1 and Kung Fu Panda 2 have been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Animated Film. All in all, the commercial success, critical acclaim, and the general popularity enjoyed by these films can be compared to or even exceeded the Disney Mulan of 1998, which pioneered the Chinese subject matter in American animated films. From a cross-cultural perspective, the Kung Fu Panda series indicates an interesting moment in Sino-American relations at the Western imagination of China. Unfortunately, the history of this cross-cultural imaginary has been filled with negative and biased stereotypes. Kung Fu Panda and the earlier Mulan are not entirely immune from these historical biases, but they do constitute a more positive thread in this history and may help generate more constructive cross-cultural relations through the apparently lighthearted form of animated films. Now, let's spend some time retracing key moments in this cross-cultural history. To begin with, for a very long period in history, China has been the exotic other in the eyes of the West. In this general context, the image of China in the West was, for the most part, more positive before the 18th century than afterwards. Before the 18th century, China had been known in the West as the land of silks and, as reported in Marco Polo's travelogue, a land of wealth. European and American demands for Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea and other goods were a driving motor for the development of transcontinental maritime navigations from the 15th to the 18th century. Cultural contacts between China and the West were quite limited before the 18th century. Since trade was mostly restricted to coastal ports, the only Europeans who got the chance to experience China's inlands were missionaries sent during what's being called the China Mission of the Catholic Church. The knowledge foundations established by these missionaries had long-lasting effects on the development of sinology, or the scholarly study of China in the West. The earliest missionary group in China was the Jesuits, represented by the erudite Matteo Ricci, who promoted an accommodation approach to reconcile Confucianism and Christianity. Western geographical, mathematical, scientific, and cultural knowledge were introduced into China during this time. In European writings on China during this time, mostly as works by missionaries, Confucius was represented as a sagely figure, and China was sometimes praised as a country ruled by the philosopher king. There were genuine interests in Chinese history and intellectual thought among European Enlightenment philosophers, such as the prominent German polymath and mathematician Leibniz, who, among other things, contributed to the invention of the modern calculus and binary numbers. Based on missionary writings on China, Leibniz became very interested in the Confucian ethical tradition and noted remarkable correspondences between the Chinese hexagrams that represent yin-yang systems and the binary numbers consisted of 0 and 1. On the other hand, despite their mostly positive and sometimes rather idealizing depictions of China's Confucian civilization, missionary writings on China usually condemns Buddhism and Daoism as idol worship or superstition. This differentiating attitude was related to the higher status of Confucianism within the class of the Chinese scholar officials, whom the missionaries tried to befriend with, and their argument, as represented by Ricci, that the Confucian spirituality is mostly secular and thus does not present any conflict against the Christian faith. On the Chinese side, Ricci and other missionaries did manage to convert some high-ranking scholar officials and even members of the royal house. However, the Mingqing dynastic transition in China in the 1640s disrupted the foundations they had built. Moreover, starting from the early Qing dynasty, the so-called Rites Controversy emerged, since some conservative Catholic orders, in particular the Dominicans and Franciscans, reported to Rome that the Confucian rites of ancestral worship were heretical rites incompatible with the Christian faith. This argument was against the previous practice of accommodation led by Jesuits such as Ricci for adapting Christianity to local customs. After several rounds of disputes that lasted to the beginning of the 18th century, Rome officially banned any Chinese Christian converts from participating in Confucian ancestral rites. This decision angered the Kangxi Emperor of the Qing dynasty, who expelled the missionary orders who refused to follow Ricci's earlier accommodation policy. Later, in the 1720s, Christian missions were banned in its entirety in Qing China. Nevertheless, the Qing Imperial Court kept some missionaries in their employment for their artistic, scientific, or linguistic skills. For instance, The missionaries brought the technique of oil painting portraits to the Qing court. Missionaries also served to design the Imperial summer palace Yuan, which was initially constructed during the early 18th century and had been expanded up to the early 19th century. These expansions included European-style buildings and gardens designed by missionary artists. Due to its combination of Eastern and Western architectures, the summer palace Yuan was once called the Garden of all Gardens, 万园之园. However, with a dark twist of history, this magnificent garden that represents earlier Eastern-Western exchanges was burned down and looted during the Century of Humiliation, when the Anglo-French army occupied Beijing during the Second Opium War in 1860. Today, only some ruins of the European-style stone architecture remain. The second half of the 19th century was also when China's image in the West reached its nadir. We have mentioned that the image of China began to deteriorate in the West since the 18th century. This happened because of the European merchants' discontents about the Canton System that came into place in 1757 under the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. The Canton System limited all foreign trade to the southern port of Canton, now Guangzhou, and a selected group of local Chinese middlemen, known as the 13 Factories, who monopolized these trades. From the Qing dynasty's perspective, the system was to control foreign influences after some incidents took place around trading ports. European merchants, especially British merchants, were nevertheless dissatisfied by the trading limits imposed on them, and began to disseminate back in Europe some highly negative accounts about China. The situation worsened with the incident of the Macartney embassy in 1793. This embassy, led by Lord Macartney, was the first British diplomatic mission to China, and its objective was to persuade the Qianlong Emperor to open new trading ports to Britain. However, the Emperor rejected all these requests on the following grounds. Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of foreigners in exchange for our own produce. Reportedly, what caused further tension in this ill-fated mission was Lord Macartney's refusal to kowtow to the Qianlong Emperor. From the Qing court's Sinocentric perspective, all foreign nations were ritually its tributary nations, and their ambassadors should acknowledge the Qing Emperor's authority as the Son of Heaven by kowtowing to him, which required one to completely kneel down and bow with one's forehead touching the ground. Upholding the British king of the time, George III, as his true sovereign, Lord Macartney refused to kowtow to Qianlong Emperor. Eventually, after much negotiation, a compromise was reached by having Lord Macartney bend one knee to the ground as in genuflection. Overall, the Macartney envoy failed to achieve any of its objectives, and the event reflects a mutual lack of knowledge and understanding on both sides. On the British side, this diplomatic failure further fueled anti-China sentiments, building to the Opium War decades later. So far, we have discussed missionary activities, trade, and politics as the historical contexts surrounding Western perceptions of China, roughly from the 17th to the early 19th century. What we should also note is the emergence of Orientalism as an art motif during this time. Briefly speaking, Orientalism refers to visual stereotypes about Asia or the Eastern world in Western artworks. The Orient depicted in this manner could include the Middle East and the Far East. Typically, Orientalist art portrays these Eastern places as exotic, mysterious domains, rather than authentic representations of the Eastern cultures. Images in Orientalist art were based on Western expectations about the East. In the given historical context, these images were heavily filtered by the imperialist and colonialist ideologies of the period. Edward Said, a Palestinian-American and literature professor, published an influential study entitled Orientalism in 1978, which criticizes Western cultural representations of the East as an extension of its colonial policies. According to Said's analysis, Orientalist images portray the East as static, passive cultures, thus implicitly justifying its subjugation by the supposedly dynamic, active Western culture. Said's critique of Orientalism became a foundational theory for contemporary post-colonial studies, which focuses on the persistence of Western colonial ideologies in global cultural domains. Admittedly, Orientalist images could often be romanticized and benign, and can perhaps be approached in a more positive cross-cultural light beyond the post-colonial framework. However, before taking that new step, it's important for us to recognize their historical baggage and their differences from authentic Eastern cultures. For instance, Orientalist arts about the Far East are often characterized by a lack of distinction between specific East Asian traditions, such as mixing up Chinese and Japanese cultural elements. Indeed, this jumbled perception of the East is still quite prevalent in the West today. Orientalist art is also characterized by so-called Eastern motifs, which are actually fabrications of the West, or based on certain misperceptions or lack of deep understanding. For instance, Chinese motifs of this kind were highly popular in European artworks, decors, and fashion during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Since France was the epicenter of this vogue, they were historically referred to by the French term chinoiserie, which means Chinese style. Decorative blue and white porcelainware was an important type of chinoiserie art object during this time. Interestingly, many of them were in fact produced in the Dutch city of Delft rather than in China. This type of ware was known as the Delftware. Since the making of true Chinese porcelain required a special type of clay and technology not yet fully understood by the Europeans during this time, Delftware was more a type of glazed pottery rather than true porcelain, which is thinner, more hardened, and translucent. Though imperfect, Delftware was extremely popular in Euro-American homes to symbolize a gentry or middle-class status. Delftware or exported Chinese porcelain from the 18th or 19th centuries, one may frequently see the so-called Willow Pattern, which is supposed to be a Chinese motif. In museums that display these objects, you may even see a Chinese legend, a tragic love story that's supposed to be a backstory of this pattern. Yet neither the pattern nor the story came from authentic Chinese sources. Rather, they seem to be a concoction of tiny bits of Chinese cultural elements and a great deal of Western imagination. For instance, the doves representing the lovers in the willow pattern clearly emerged from the Western tradition, perhaps either as an accidental misrepresentation or purposeful reinvention of the mandarin ducks, the lovebirds in the Chinese tradition. Another interesting image is the pagoda. Pagoda or Ta is a type of Buddhist architecture that evolved from the Indian stupa. It's usually the most prominent building in a Buddhist monastery and symbolizes Buddhist salvation. The significance of the architecture in Buddhism emerged from the legend that the Buddha's ashes after his passing and cremation were buried in 8 holy stupas across India. The original Indian form of the stupa resembles that of a domed tomb, but the architecture took on many different forms through Buddhism's spread across Asia. In China, it became a layered tower that came to be referred to as the pagoda in English, which could be built by stone or wood and typically used to enshrine relics and Buddhist scriptures. Given the popularity of Buddhism, the pagoda was an extremely prevalent sight in traditional China, whereas it's quite natural that European travelers noticed and reported back this type of architecture. Their sacred Buddhist connotations were typically neglected in these representations. Through the 18th and early 19th centuries, the pagoda became an extremely prevalent image in European art representing China, and they replicated pagodas in European gardens, the grandest and most famous of which is in the Kew Gardens in London. However, in European replications, the pagoda is always separated from its monastic surroundings of a Buddhist temple and thus becomes a purely exotic spectacle without much history or inner substance. And somewhat ironically, the pagoda thus became an essentialized symbol about China, even though it first entered China as an Indian and foreign architecture and evolved through complex cross-cultural flows. In Kung Fu Panda II, the image of the European version of the pagoda appears rather prominently as the villain Shen's base. Although this design perhaps works in the context of the animated movie, we should note its historical roots rest more in the Orientalist or chinoiserie tradition rather than authentic Chinese architecture. Of course, whatever criticism we may give to Orientalist images, such as the Willow Pattern or the chinoiserie pagoda, they certainly do not represent the worst of Western representations of China. Indeed, likely we need to distinguish between more benign forms of Orientalism, which aim at creating exotic wonders and curiosity, and other malicious types that directly work to instigate hate, division, and discrimination. These malicious types characterize the yellow peril stereotypes we'll discuss next. Yellow peril stereotypes rose in the West as China's international status reached its nadir during the century of humiliation, roughly from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries. Earlier on, in our lecture on Once Upon a Time in China, we have mentioned the coolie trade of the 19th century. It's now better understood that conditions for coolie laborers were no better than slaves in Central American destinations such as Cuba. In the case of the US, the current scholarly perception is that coolie laborers had greater independence working in the gold mines and transcontinental railroads, and therefore they have been more often referred to as immigrant workers. However, the trans-Pacific travel for many of these workers were a perilous journey, and they left virtually no voice of their own, so it's difficult to assess their actual conditions. In the US, these laborers worked on the hardest and most dangerous jobs for about one-fourth of the average salary, since they were fleeing from extreme poverty in a war-torn China during this time. Initially, in the early 1850s, West Coast states such as California welcomed Chinese workers as cheap, controllable labor. However, as gold mine production started to dry out, and U.S. economy experienced decline in the 1860s, politicians on the state and federal levels and various social organizations during this time began to scapegoat Chinese workers. Violence against Chinese workers also broke out in California. Some lawmakers in California began to push for anti-Chinese immigration laws as early as the late 1850s. Eventually, the Page Act was passed at the federal level in 1875 to prevent Chinese women from entering the U.S. This was quickly followed by the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act forbidding all Chinese immigration at the state level in California in 1879, and soon later at the federal level in 1882, signed by the then President Chester Arthur. Through various extensions and revisions, the legal effects of this law lasted up to 1965 for almost a century. The Chinese Exclusion Act is one of the most discriminatory laws in American history, targeting at a specific nationality. It also embodies one of the darkest moments in China-West relations. The Chinese population remaining in the U.S. was deprived of many rights and experienced mob violence and lynching. All these legal injustices and mob violence took place side by side with racist, inflammatory, and demonizing representations of China and of the Chinese people in American media, especially in political cartoons of the time. The same xenophobia, a hatred of China and of the Chinese, prevailed many other places of the Western world as well. In this cultural atmosphere, the term yellow peril emerged in Western writings to refer to the imagined threats coming from the East and from East Asian peoples, who have been referred to as the yellow race. A stock racist image that appeared in this process is Zhang Chinaman, typically depicted with a long queue of the Qing dynasty style. In some images, he is beaten or kicked by a white man. In others, he is portrayed as a murderer and rapist. There are numerous anti-Chinese images from this period. In this cartoon from 1902, The American Gulliver and the Chinese Lilliputians, Chinese workers are compared to the Lilliputians, the little midgets in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, pinning down the Gulliver representing the American worker. In an Australian cartoon from 1899, the Chinese is represented as an octopus-like demonic figure infested with all evils. In a Russian cartoon from 1901, we see an unnaturally feminized Chinese man is cooking Western soldiers in a teapot. These are but a few examples. In the 20th century, one pop culture figure that embodies the continuation of the yellow peril imaginary is Fu Manchu, a supervillain created by a British author named Sax Rohmer. Rohmer published his first Fu Manchu novel in 1913. There, he describes this supervillain in the following words. Imagine a person, tall, lean, and feline, high-shouldered, with a brow like Shakespeare and a face like Satan. One giant intellect, with all the resources of science past and present. Imagine that all-whole being, and you have a mental picture of Dr. Fu Manchu, the yellow peril incarnate in one man. The Fu Manchu in Rohmer's depiction is sly, murderous, mysterious, while having an almost supernatural intelligence. Rohmer wrote more than 10 Fu Manchu novels, and these stories, as well as new ones, were adapted into many comic books, TV shows, and films. As a pop culture figure, Fu Manchu enjoyed popularity well into the 1970s. In more recent decades, blatant forms of anti-Chinese racism gradually receded in Western culture, but they never went away and could be rekindled any moment. The Cold War era, political differences, economic competition, and the China threat theory that prevails in the US and other Western nations certainly sustain the continuous presence of xenophobia in the Western world, while China and Chinese culture continue to be poorly understood by the general public. Here are a few images from Western cartoons from the 2000s to the 2020s, whenever certain tension arose between China and the West. In one American cartoon, a buck-toothed Chinese waiter serves the bizarre and completely fabricated food of crispy fried cat gizzards with noodles. In another French cartoon, actually entitled Yellow Peril, we see a yellow-faced man holding a blonde sitting in a rickshaw pulled by a Frenchman in a Paris apparently dominated by Chinese influences. All these are signs that the Yellow Peril imaginary is far from over. Next, to further connect this historical context to the film industry, let's briefly discuss Chinese images in Hollywood. For Chinese Americans, even during the better years of the West's reception of China and people of Chinese descent, their experiences have been shadowed by being almost invisible in American public life and being perceived as the perpetual foreigner. After the end of the legal effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1965, people of Chinese descent immigrated into the US, often as skilled professionals, thus generating a model minority myth. Within corporations and social and political life, however, certain bamboo ceiling, as it came to be called, persists as barriers against the advancement of Chinese Americans. One place where this bamboo ceiling can be sensed is the media space, such as in TV and films. Earlier on, we have mentioned that Bruce Lee failed to land in a lead role in American TV or films despite his superb skills. Lee's experience in the 1960s and 70s was but a continuation of earlier Hollywood practices of marginalizing Chinese or Asian actors. In fact, it used to be the Hollywood norm to assign white actors and actresses to portray any leading characters who are supposed to be of Asian descent through so-called yellow face makeups. Fu Manchu in films, for instance, was portrayed by the English actor Christopher Lee. One prominent stereotypical feature of the elaborate yellow face makeup is the creation of the so-called Oriental or slanted eye. Even today, the idea of this eye type persists as a racial stereotype about the East Asian look, and you can clearly see it in the Disney image of Mulan. Yet obviously the eye types of East Asian peoples are as diverse as any other ethnicities. Neither does the Oriental eye in Western perceptions correspond to any Asian standards of beauty or aesthetic tradition. Within this whole context of the East's mostly negative or marginalized presence in Western perceptions throughout history, when we say that the case of Kung Fu Panda, however trivial it may look and however imperfect it still is, exemplifies a more positive type of cross-cultural construction. The antecedent to this animated film can be traced to Bruce Lee's breaking of the Hollywood bamboo ceiling by introducing Kung Fu cinema to the American public and becoming the first non-white superstar in American pop culture. Li's success opened doors for the popularity of later Kung Fu stars, especially Jackie Chan, in American films, and solidified the significance of Kung Fu as a representation of the Chinese heritage in American pop culture. However, due to a lack of diversification of Chinese subject matters, and the continuous absence of any substantial education about China or Asia in the US general education system, there is also a danger that Kung Fu in itself becomes a stereotype or stays on the level of a merely exotic spectacle without much substance. This caveat aside, the Kung Fu Panda series, similar to the Disney Mulan before it, helped create a more positive presence of Chinese culture, especially for younger viewers. As indicated by our earlier discussion, in terms of their visual representations of China, these films are more or less influenced by the Orientalism in Western art, but these influences belong to the benign form. In comparison to the Disney Mulan made 10 years before the first Kung Fu Panda film, the Kung Fu Panda films, when we look at them closely, do express more substantial engagement with the deeper layers of Chinese culture, especially the philosophical themes underlying Chinese Kung Fu films. Moreover, we have mentioned that the second and third films in the series are directed by a Korean-American female director, Yuh Nelson, who's also the head of story for the first film. The third Kung Fu Panda film was also made as a co-production of DreamWorks and the Shanghai-based Pearl Studio, or Oriental DreamWorks, Dongfang Menggongchang, a Chinese-American joint venture founded in 2012 by DreamWorks Animation and Chinese investment companies. 1/3 of the film was made in China and the rest at the DreamWorks studio in the United States. Kung Fu Panda III was the first major American animated feature film co-produced with a Chinese studio. In these ways, the Kung Fu Panda series emerged from a more diverse transnational production team with heavy involvement of filmmakers of Asian descent and later from China. In terms of its content, the most interesting and prominent premise of this series is a panda protagonist. On this point, we should briefly discuss how the giant panda became a modern icon and ambassador of sort of China. Since they were very rare and lived mostly in the mountainous southwest regions, giant pandas were rarely known in traditional China, even though sometimes they appear in historical records as rare animal tributes to the imperial court or as gifts to other countries. For instance, it seems like China's only woman emperor Wu Zetian sent a pair of pandas to Emperor Tianmu of Japan in 685. The modern discovery and research of the species likely began with Western zoologists in China around the mid-19th century. In 1941, Su Meiling, the wife of Chiang Kai-shek and the First Lady of the Republic of China during the time, gifted a pair of giant pandas named Panda and Pandi to an American organization that was sending aid to Chinese refugees during the Second World War. This practice anticipated the panda diplomacy of the People's Republic of China later. In the PRC era, giant pandas gradually became a widely recognized national symbol through the practice of panda diplomacy. That is, the Chinese government sent pandas to foreign governments to show goodwill and cultivate good relations. The most important practice of this kind took place as a result of the Nixon visit to Beijing in 1972, which built to the normalization of diplomatic relations between the US and the People's Republic of China, since the two governments had remained hostile to one another since 1949. During this visit, Pat Nixon, the American First Lady, visited the pandas in the Beijing Zoo. Shortly afterwards, as a gesture to improve relations, the Beijing government sent to Washington a pair of pandas named Xing and Ling. After arriving at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. in 1972, these pandas attracted millions of visitors per year. The presence of these pandas in Washington and later in other U.S. zoos, such as San Diego, spread the image of the giant panda as a symbol of China to the American public. Unfortunately, none of the cubs of the first pandas, Xing and Ling, survived, but these pandas themselves lived very long lives. Ling passed away in 1992 and Xing in 1999. Now, in their place in the National Zoo are a new pair of pandas sent by China in 2000, Meixiang and Tiantian. Per agreement between the two countries, all the pandas are leased and China possesses ownership of the pandas and their offspring. As to the Kung Fu Panda series, its premise is built on integrating two cultural elements associated with China, Kung Fu and Panda. What makes this integration work on a deeper level is that it inherits the spirit of Kung Fu comedies, such as those by Jackie Chan and Stephen Chow, by telling the story of an underdog. The features of the panda protagonist pose movements also mirror those of the grotesque body in Kung Fu comedies. The Kung Fu Panda series also set within a framework of Eastern philosophies. Especially, these films consistently allude to Daoism and the idea of Wu Wei or non-action. Early on in this class, we've mentioned that the name of the tortoise master, Wu Gui, in the films is a pun of both the Chinese word for tortoise, Wu Gui, and the Taoist principle of Wu Wei. In the Chinese tradition, the tortoise has been associated with longevity and spirituality. Early on, we have mentioned that as early as the Shang dynasty, at the beginning of Chinese civilization, tortoise shells have been used for inscribing divination texts. In the Kung Fu Panda series, it's clear Master Wu Gui represents the highest wisdom and power, and his teaching often hints at the importance of looking beyond merely physical forms and powers. At moments, he even appears to be a larger-than-life figure, as someone who can cross between the human world and the other world. This power of his is especially obvious in the third film. Master Wu Gui's embodiment of Wu Wei and the Tao is also expressed by his follow-the-flow approach. In a memorable line from the first film, he thus speaks to Po. Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift. That is why it is called present. Wu Gui's Taoist principles are contrasted to and balanced with the teaching approach of Shifu, the red panda character that's reminiscent of the image of Yoda from Star Wars. In Kung Fu Panda films, Shifu is a strict teacher and embodies the Confucian approach to learning. Even though Shifu's wisdom and power pale in comparison to those of Wu Gui, he's an enduring character and is shown to be an indispensable mentor for Po's growth. Of course, Po's mentors also include the Furious Five. By the setup of Po's education, we can see a theme of community in the films, or how it takes a village for the hero's transformation. The animal symbolisms of the Furious Five are based on traditional styles of martial arts, which sometimes imitate the movements of specific animals. These styles are often performed in Kung Fu films. For instance, The other film Jackie Chan made in 1978 along with Drunken Master is Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, which features his viper or snake style of fighting. Back to the image of Po himself, his black and white pattern further hints on the yin-yang pattern of Tao. This implication is made obvious when the second film shows that he temporarily transforms into the Taiji symbol in his final battle against the villain Shin, according to the prophecy at the beginning of the film. In the first film, Daoism and the mirroring idea of emptiness in Buddhism are further indicated by the motif of the blank dragon scroll. Whereas this is the object of desire for the villain Tai Lung in the first film, an object that promises ultimate power and status, it eventually turns out to be empty. When Po gets hold of the scroll, all he can see is an image of himself. This scene certainly evokes of the philosophy of nothingness in Daoism and Buddhism, and may remind us of the empty scripture in The Journey to the West or the Buddha's Palm Manual in Kung Fu Hustle. Perhaps the pamphlet in Kung Fu Hustle is the direct inspiration of this plot. All in all, this ending of the first film very much corresponds to our theme of the power of emptiness. In letting Po see his own reflection in the scroll, it further suggests the American value of self-reliance, thus creating a subtle but insightful East-West fusion of philosophies and ethics. The film nicely extends the theme of emptiness expressed by the blank scroll to the story of the secret ingredient revealed by Mr. Ping, Poe's foster father. In his words to Poe, "To make something special, you just have to believe it's special." Opening a noodle shop, Mr. Ping may at first glance look like a somewhat stereotypical Chinatown character, and his noodle dream is drastically at odds with Poe's grander Kung Fu dream. However, the film steadily reveals his sincere care for Poe, and the secret ingredient episode at the end shows his inner wisdom accumulated through everyday hard work. In this regard, the film suggests that Mr. Ping is no less a spiritual guide for Poe than Master Wu Gui. Finally, let's quickly talk about how the second and third films expand the founding themes of the first film and continues to make the series interesting and meaningful. The second film opens with a prelude about the obsession of the villain Shin in making firearms. The story alludes to the fact that Chinese invented gunpowder but didn't develop the technology into modern weaponry as in the European case. In fact, among both the Chinese public and Western observers, a popular question that has been asked during the contemporary period is why the Chinese used gunpowder for making fireworks rather than guns. From a West-centric perspective, which normalizes the modern military technology and its history of colonialism and conquest, or from the perspective of social Darwinism, this historical development implies a lack of foresight or cultural backwardness on the Chinese side. However, Kung Fu Panda II turns this theory on its head by showing Shin's perverted pursuit for power with his reinvention of gunpowder for killing. Meaningfully, at the end of the final battle, the gunpowder transforms back to fireworks, affirming the value of community building and artistic expressions related to this traditional use of gunpowder. Indeed, Poe's battle against Shin in the second film in many ways echoes the Kung Fu versus guns conflict we see in Kung Fu films such as Once Upon a Time in China. In the final battle, this conflict is symbolized as a battle between fire and water. The significance of the water image in this scene again alludes to water's association with Daoism, and with supreme virtue in the Chinese tradition. In the third film, the villain is the blue demon Kai, the image of which is based on the demon from the Journey to the West, who derives his power from a perverted form of qi he collects through conquest and killing. This perverted qi is contrasted to the true spirituality embodied by Wu Gui and Po. One important plot development in the film is Poe's entrance into a panda village and re-encounter with his birth father. The panda village is depicted as a utopia similar to the peach blossom spring Taohua Yuan in the most famous utopia story in traditional Chinese literature, which is a hidden village removed from worldly strife and corruptions. Notably, the pandas possesses the power of healing. During the final battle, the community of pandas from the village collaborate to infuse Po with a transformative power, turning him into the true dragon warrior and help him defeat Kai. This scene indicates the genuine power of qi rests in the bond of the community versus Kai's egoistic quest for the power to dominate. With this theme, the third film further enriches the Kung Fu Panda series. In these slides, we can see that the Kung Fu Panda series deserves to be not only enjoyed by children, but also more seriously thought about by adults. In the context of the persistently negative or superficial perceptions of China in the West, the series certainly perform a positive role in improving relations and exemplify genuine and educated efforts in incorporating Chinese philosophical traditions. In this series, we can witness the reinvention of a number of themes we have observed from the Chinese martial arts cultural tradition. From the blank scroll to the secret ingredient, and the extension of these themes in the second and third films, the Kung Fu Panda series also illustrate the power of emptiness through thoughtful plots and scenes, thus revealing the universal cosmopolitan meanings with this traditional Chinese philosophical motif. Upon this hopeful note, we conclude all the lectures for this class. I hope you enjoy what you have learned and discussed through the semester. I look forward to your final project and hope to see you in another class.